Today, across the world, there are over 60 million people displaced from their homes. This is due to war, political oppression, and outright banishment. Here to talk about the world refugee crisis is a former refugee himself, Mlado Ivanović. He is a visiting professor at Grand Valley State University doing research on refugees. Mlado, thanks for coming to the studio today.
Thanks for having me, Alan.
So tell me a little bit about your personal refugee story. So you're originally from Serbia.
Actually, I was born in Bosnia. My father is Serb from Bosnia. So quite some time ago, I was born in a northeastern city in Bosnia called Tuzla. So most of my childhood I spent, of course, in Bosnia until the 1992, where, let's say, less fortunate events started to occur in that part of the world, and I was forced to leave my home with my mother. So we ended up as refugees first in Traiskirchen, Austria. Luckily, we had some family members living in Vienna, so the adaptation period was not as difficult as it could be. And yeah, that for the most part was basically something that has placed a mark on my life, especially at such a young age when people still develop their values.
You were in your early teens?
Yeah, I was 13 years old when the war started in Bosnia. So
now you had glossed over that a bit euphemistically. You said some difficulties. We're talking about genocide.
Yeah. Situation in Bosnia back during the whole civil war was both ethically, politically, and culturally very complex. So there was lots of atrocities, lots of human rights violations. Of course, the one that is most evident and most well known is, of course, like the event in Srebrenica, where the Serbian paramilitary units have rounded up and murdered almost 8,000 Bosniak men and civilians. So all that, to some extent, has marked my path as an academic and as an activist.
Sure.
I don't really see myself that these two roles are kind of distinct. Rather, they conflate and they fulfill each other's meaning.
Sure. And I want to talk in just a minute about your current work, which is very important. But just for clarification for our viewers, when we talk about refugees from that region, especially to the United States, we usually talk about Bosnians. But you were ethnically, linguistically, religiously Serbian. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Okay. Well, the situation in Balkan in general, like in former Yugoslavia, is there's lots of confusion in the Western world and media. What's historically, linguistically, culturally, traditionally going on in these parts of the world. Regarding Bosnia, of course, the language itself is almost the same. I mean, there are certain accents that kind of differ, but there's no significant change in vocabulary.
What year was it that you and your mom finally landed in the United States?
We ended up as refugees actually in Austria in '92. My connection with the United States is purely academic. So I arrived in a beautiful city of Lansing 7 years ago, 2009, fall 2009, where I started my PhD program at the Department of Philosophy at Michigan State University. So that was my only connection to United States. So before that, I mean, what I could gather from books and, of course, the movies and this kind of popular culture, that was my knowledge of United States. And, of course, the political context of the events that have occurred in the last, let's say, 30 years that I can actually trace back and memorize.
So English is actually your third language after Serbian and German?
Correct. Okay. Correct. English kind of was a second banana in my linguistic development.
Yeah. So I want to talk about what you're doing today, because I had a chance to attend a symposium that the university sponsored just a week ago, and some amazing conversations. Talk about the teaching you're doing in the context of the global refugee crisis.
Okay. Well, first of all, this question demands a bit more context. There's, in academia, and of course in kind of common sense understanding of philosophy, is something that is detached from the reality, something that is almost kind of abstract, vague, elitistic in itself. And I'm coming from a philosophical background that doesn't really consider philosophy having such a role in academia and reality. Philosophy itself is always defining itself in this kind of process of interaction with different disciplines. So I consider myself as an interdisciplinary philosopher. And another very important component, of course, it's practical engagement, applying these often abstract concepts to concrete ongoing issues. So if I have to define myself as a philosopher, I will probably say that I'm moral and social and political philosopher who is predominantly focusing on the issues of social and global justice, on the issues of humanism and humanitarianism itself.
So what are your students learning?
My students are learning about a very complex web of responsibilities that we all have, being members of this globe who is so fragile, interconnected in so many different ways. They learn about their own position in the world and how their choices and how their actions have impact on people that they will probably never see during their lives. Many people who come to my classes, especially from the western side of Michigan, are very young. That means that they still didn't have chance to travel abroad, didn't have chance to kind of face or directly encounter these different cultures and different social contexts. So for them often comes a surprise when they realize that, for example, even something what seems very simple to us as choice of consumerism, where we buy, what we buy, and so on, actually impacts lives of millions and millions of other people around the globe.
I'd really like to go back to this issue of what causes refugees and with some specific examples.
Okay. My own research, of course, and rotates and focuses actually on the questions of forceful displacement and migration. And this in itself has become a topic that has seen front pages in the last 3-4 years. And yet I really think that to some extent I have a feeling like the more we know, the less we care, the less we actually understand what's really going on.
Do you think we're becoming numb to it?
Not so much numb, but I think that the distance that we have as people who live in West, people who have a certain privileged existence, and by this I don't argue that all people living in the United States have privileged existence, that's not the case. But let's say that specific audience that is a target of humanitarian organizations and so on, that basically families with certain financial capacity to provide aid, that distance, that is inescapable distance between us and the living conditions that other people experience abroad, is something that often results in a certain indifference and helplessness, and fatigue, moral fatigue, compassion fatigue, that basically prevents people to exercise these ethical, political principles that our society, our democratic society, is actually founded upon. Going back to refugees and questions of forceful displacement, I mean, what often reaches the front pages of the newspapers, online news agencies, and so on are events tied to violence. So like ongoing crisis in the Middle East, especially with Syria, Iraq, and then farther east with Afghanistan.
And that poor toddler who washed up on the Mediterranean
Exactly.
shore.
The story with Aylan Kurdi is sadly one of the tragic testimonies what's really going on. And it's also a tragic testimony of our position. And by our position, I mean like position of the Western humanitarian agents, Western societies, because a death of a 2-year-old kid is always a death too much. And despite the very increased attention, public attention on social media, like Facebook, Twitter, we had countless public tribunes, events that were talking about these things, that has not really achieved much, because after Aylan Kurdi's tragic death, there were like 200 more children who actually drowned in the Mediterranean. So the question is basically, okay, what does this visibility that such tragic losses have actually puts in motion? actually puts anything at all.
And I want to conclude on that note, because you call yourself a practical philosopher.
Yeah.
What can people do? Because the problem seems so big. What's one small thing that our viewers could do?
I think that despite the fact that this problem is overwhelming, that it's overwhelming in scope and intensity, that doesn't mean that people like you, people like me, my students cannot actually do something about it. The fact is that many of the causes of what's really going on are pretty global and geopolitical. That means that are beyond our grasp to some extent. They are kind of decisions that are made by spheres of power that are not capacity of a normal citizen. But leaving that aside, there are many things that we can actually do. Help, being human, doesn't involve much of financial sacrifice, actually doesn't involve any sacrifice at all. People just need to feel need, the compassionate drive, empathetical drive to help others. Using my position as a professor, of course, as an academic, I try to organize projects that basically directly translate this kind of theoretical, moral framework into concrete action. We have already established some connections with organizations that are already present in the western side of Michigan, like, for example, Bethany Christian Services, who to some extent is doing a tremendously good job with managing all these people who are coming to our society, coming to our world.
If some of our viewers wanted to get in touch and wanted to actually get involved, who should they contact? Should they contact you, a local refugee?
There are so many ways to be engaged. As you said, like they can be engaged in the projects that we organize, both in community and outside of the borders of the United States. They also can participate with so many efforts like done by other organizations like Bethany Christian Services, providing basic necessities for people, helping with English proficiencies. One of the fundamental, of course, necessities for people who are coming to a different environment, both cultural and political and social, is to brave this kind of huge wall of language. Without language, people cannot communicate. Even sometimes with perfect knowledge of language, people end up in misunderstandings. In the case of refugees, that's even a bigger problem and bigger issue. Often what happens is that people tend to put the blame on people who are coming in our societies. And I think that's a mistake.
We really need to look in the mirror.
Exactly. I think that first step in understanding what's really going on in the world is understanding ourselves and understanding our own position in the world. And as I said, like what kind of choices, what kind of actions we put in motion, and how these things how our agency itself actually results in things that are more global. Mm-hmm. From consumerism, from ways how we treat people who are different, because difference is often used as something that can justify the violence. Even those kind of very subtle forms of violence, like symbolic violence or structural violence, where people are marginalized by institutions and ongoing interaction that they have with people within host societies. So one way how actually our students can help is basically help with these basic things, helping people getting their administrative visibility in place,
sure.
Getting them driving licenses, being reported, organizing events where these differences between cultural outlooks, between kind of political perspectives can be attenuated in a way that the differences are not source of discord, division, and gap, rather like something that both sides can learn and benefit from. Mm-hmm. And of course, these kind of small steps in organizing these very effective small things, driving someone to state office that will take probably 45 minutes of time,
sure.
To bigger projects that we already have in place, like organizing reception centers at, for example, Serbian and Hungarian border for people who are warehoused in the no-man zone without proper sanitation, without proper access to food and water. Where actually what many people praise as a successful humanitarian regime completely fails. So if I have to kind of summarize my message to my students, to the people in audience, your friends and your viewers, is basically that every even small thing actually matters.
Awesome.
Even seeing someone at the street being completely confused or mesmerized by the environment and coming and putting a smile on your face and asking if that person needs a help means a lot, especially because that meant to me, a 13-year-old boy who ended up in a society that I didn't know the German language. The cultural differences were still present. I was coming kind of from a very left socialist background that former Yugoslavia was to a modern Western society.
Sure.
So the transition, it was not really easy. But luckily I had people who reached out. And I think reaching out is a first predisposition of a successful adaptation and inclusion of these people who are coming to our part of the world.
So on that last note, we've been talking about some really profound cases of creating unwelcome for people. Turn that around. What creates belonging?
Belonging is in itself a trait of being human, because everywhere we go, even if you leave Grand Rapids and drive 300 miles away, what really makes you feel as a part of the community, as a part of the world, as a human being, because being human means that you are part of the community. And I think what I mean by community is that you're recognized by people, recognized as equal, recognized as a person who has equal moral value.
I see you.
I see you, exactly. That we do not remain numb or silent when we witness like these despicable images of dead children who drown at our doorsteps of the civilized Europe. Rather like to remember those things, remember the suffering of these people, and realize that sometimes even smile, a handshake, a hug matters a lot. There are so many differences in the world. Often these differences prevent us to feel that kind of belonging. I personally always say that belonging is there where your heart is, and heart is always tied with people around you. So the people are actually what creates that sense of belonging, not these almost practical, commodified aspects of our lives like house, garden, car, city we live in, but are like people. People who surround us, people who help us when we are in need, people who share laughter with us when we are happy, people who come to birthdays, weddings, people who share the food even if the food is different. So that's the sense of belonging, and I think that again puts, to some extent, a certain, I don't want to say burden, because I don't find that's a burden for people who live in the United States or the Western European societies, rather like privilege to welcome people, to show who we really are, to show our values in a way that are inclusive.
Show our humanity.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, we're going to have to leave it there, but I want to thank you so much for coming by. It's been a real pleasure having you.
Thank you, Alan, for giving me this opportunity to speak about this, and I enjoyed it.
Great. Thank you for joining us today. If you're home watching on TV, stay tuned for our upcoming segments on American English, culture, and humor. Our viewers on the internet can catch these segments on our What's Up and What's So Funny web pages. See you again soon.
Because if 1 week out of the month you are without feminine hygiene products, or you're anxious about where to get them, surely you can't focus enough at a job, you can't focus enough in an education training program, and it becomes hard for women to succeed.